For the first time in human history, a man is floating free in open space. It's 1965, and Alexei Leonov is tied to his 18-foot tether with nobody else around. Outside the ship, the suit that had fit through the hatch 12 minutes ago was now a different object entirely. Leonov pushes against the suit, pulls against it, trying to force joints that will not bend, and gloves that no longer reach his fingers. 110 miles below, as the Soviet Union celebrates, the live broadcast suddenly cuts to silence. Without explanation, state radio begins playing Mozart's Requiem on loop. By 1963, the Soviet Union had won every major first in the history of spaceflight. First satellite, first animal in orbit, first man in space, first woman in space, first multi-person crew, one after another. The Soviets planted their flag on every frontier, and America could only sit and watch. The man behind nearly all of it was Sergei Korolev, a quiet engineer who had survived Stalin's gulags and came out the other side as the most capable rocket designer alive. His OKB-1 design bureau produced the rockets and the iconic Voskhod capsule, the steel sphere just over 7 feet across that could keep one person alive in orbit for a few days and bring them home. However, it had no engine to maneuver with, no way to dock with another spacecraft. The pilot sat in an ejection seat because the landing system was not reliable enough to bring a human being all the way to the ground safely. So cosmonauts had no choice but to bail out a few miles up and parachute down separately. But by 1963, the Voskhod capsule, a first-generation machine, had been pushed as far as it could go. With the next-gen spacecraft, Soyuz, still years away from being ready, the Americans were about to drive something extraordinary into this gap: the Gemini spacecraft. This NASA creation carried 2 astronauts and had its own maneuvering engine. It could change its orbit, chase down other spacecraft, and even rendezvous in space, capable of up to 2 weeks of operations. In early 1965, the agency announced that during one of the first Gemini flights, an astronaut would open the hatch, push outside, and float free in open space, something no human being had ever attempted. Back in Moscow, Korolev looked at his timeline and did the math. Knowing there was no way the Soyuz would be ready, his engineers took the old Voskhod and pulled out the ejection seat, squeezing in 2 seats for 2 cosmonauts, bolted at a different angle to the frame with shock absorbers since there was no longer enough room for a proper mounting system. They added padding to the walls and bolted an inflatable airlock onto the outside, a collapsible tube that a cosmonaut could crawl through to reach open space without depressurizing the whole cabin. This so-called new vehicle, named Voskhod, also had no launch escape system. If something went wrong in the first 45 seconds after liftoff, there was nothing to do. When it came time to choose who would actually step outside the spacecraft, Korolev knew just who to call. His ideal cosmonaut for this one-of-a-kind mission was not just any other pilot, but someone who could navigate, operate the radio, diagnose a mechanical failure, and make split-second decisions. Most importantly, he had to do all this while inside a capsule not much bigger than a wardrobe. At the selection meeting, he laid out his case for a 29-year-old lieutenant named Alexei Leonov. In addition to his physical fitness, his deep knowledge of the spacecraft systems, and his record as a pilot, Korolev added one more reason. He believed that the first human being to float free in open space should be someone capable of not just surviving it, but truly seeing it, and Leonov was a lifelong artist. The committee agreed. Training began in July 1964 on a modified Tupolev 104 passenger jet that would climb steeply and then dive, producing around 30 seconds of weightlessness in the arc between the two. Leonov used those 30 seconds to practice crawling in and out of an airlock mock-up bolted inside the cabin, building the muscle memory for a sequence he would eventually have to perform 110 miles above the Earth. But even in those brief intervals, something was terribly wrong. The suit was inflating and stiffening, far beyond what the engineers had predicted, the joints resisting, the gloves swelling away from the hands inside them. In the vacuum of space, with no outside pressure pushing back against it, the suit would balloon outward until it was almost completely rigid, leaving the person inside unable to bend their arms, grip anything, or fit back through the hatch. Still, with the American project closer than ever for launch, there was no time left to fix it. In February 1965, the Soviets launched an unmanned test flight under the designation Cosmos 57, specifically to verify that the airlock system worked before a human being trusted their life to it. But when two Soviet ground stations accidentally transmitted conflicting signals at the same moment, the onboard computer read it as a reentry command and fired the rockets. And when the burn failed, since the spacecraft was pointing the wrong way, the automated system completed a self-destruction, scattering hundreds of pieces of debris across low Earth orbit. Nonetheless, the State Commission set the launch date, March 18, 1965, 5 days before the first crewed Gemini flight. Leonov would walk out to his launch pad, having never seen the airlock system complete a single successful test. The morning of March 18, 1965, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan was cold and gray, with low clouds sitting flat across the steppe. 3 men in suits sat on the bus to the rocket. Alexei Leonov would be the man to go outside. Next to him was Lieutenant Colonel Pavel Belyaev, 39, the oldest active cosmonaut in the Soviet program and Leonov's commander for the mission. And finally, Yuri Gagarin, the first human being ever to leave the Earth, was now assigned as their capsule commander, the familiar voice they would hear from mission control once they were up. He and Leonov had been close friends for years. Gagarin had nicknamed him Blondie. The rocket was already on the pad when they arrived, a 150-foot column of metal standing in the rain. At 10 a.m. Moscow time, the engines lit. The rocket climbed hard through the low cloud and disappeared within seconds, leaving what one engineer on the ground later described as a hole in the blanket of clouds. In the Kremlin, Brezhnev and the entire Politburo were watching on specially installed monitors. Inside the capsule, once the shaking of liftoff had settled into the steadier hum of orbital flight, the 2 men began working through their checklist. During the first orbit, Belyaev activated the airlock inflation from a control panel inside the cabin. Through the window, they could see the accordion-like tube extending slowly against the side of the spacecraft, pressurizing and stiffening into shape. Once it held, Belyaev turned back inside and began helping Leonov into his life support backpack. Now flying 110 miles above the Earth, during the second orbit, and every check completed, cosmonaut Leonov pulled himself into the narrow tube of the airlock, and his partner sealed the hatch behind him. The backpack carried a maximum of 45 minutes of oxygen. From this point on, there was nothing Belyaev could do. Finally, at 11:34 a.m. Moscow time, Leonov opened the outer hatch, and for the first time in human history, a person stepped into open space. Leonov pushed himself out into open space, and without thinking, he said it out loud, quote, "The Earth is round after all." Below him, in a single glance, he could see from the Straits of Gibraltar, across the Mediterranean, all the way to the Caspian Sea, even the boot of Italy. And to his left, the Baltic Sea and the Bay of Kaliningrad, a place he had known since childhood, now visible in its entirety. He floated at the end of his 18-foot tether, the sun warm on the small strip of his face not covered by the visor filter. The silence was unlike anything he had encountered in training. The only thing he could hear was his own heartbeat. Turning away from the sun, stars came into view, not just ahead, but in every direction simultaneously. Back in the Soviet Union, all of it was being broadcast live on state television. At Leonov's parents' home, journalists began gathering outside. His elderly father, a man who had not been told in advance what the mission involved, stood among them and shouted, quote, "Why is he acting like a juvenile delinquent? Everyone else can complete their mission properly, inside the spacecraft. What is he doing clambering about outside? Somebody must tell him to get back inside immediately. He must be punished for this." Yet in the Kremlin, Brezhnev called up directly to congratulate him, quote, "We are proud of you. We wish you success. Take care. We await your safe arrival on Earth." Outside the spacecraft, Leonov had been floating for around 8 minutes when he noticed something was wrong. His fingertips were no longer touching the ends of his gloves. His feet had pulled away from the inside of his boots. The suit had ballooned outward until it was almost completely rigid. He tried to re-enter feet first, the way they had trained. The suit was too rigid, too wide, the balloon fabric catching against the rim of the airlock. He pulled back out and tried again, looking for an angle that might work. There wasn't one. The suit that had fit through the hatch 12 minutes ago was now a different object entirely, and he had around 30 minutes of oxygen left. Without consulting Belyayev, without telling Mission Control, without telling anyone, Leonov reached for a valve on the inside of his suit and began bleeding pressure out of it. He knew exactly what he was risking. At a certain pressure, nitrogen bubbles began forming in the bloodstream, the same thing that kills divers who surface too fast. He was heading toward that threshold, and he kept going anyway, because the only alternative was running out of oxygen outside the spacecraft with no way back in. The suit began to give, enough that when he turned himself around and went in head first, he was able to squeeze through. But now he was facing the wrong way, inside a tube barely wide enough to move in, and the outer hatch still had to be closed before Belyayev could let him back in. So he curled his body in the narrow space, the heat from the exertion climbing through him, and pulled the hatch shut behind him. By the time he scrambled back into the capsule, his uniform was soaked through, his heart pounding. Belyayev took one look at his pale face and told him to rest. The whole thing had taken nearly 20 minutes longer than planned. And the Soviet public had seen none of it. At some point during the crisis, without explanation, the live broadcast was cut. In its place, on state radio, Mozart's Requiem began to play again and again, confusing the audience. After a while, when his heart rate had come down and the sweat had begun to dry, Leonov reached for his colored pencils and made 4 sketches of what he had seen outside, becoming the first artist outside of Earth. He drew the planet and the curve of the horizon, the black sky full of stars in every direction. It was the only record he could make of it, since the camera mounted on his chest had been unreachable the entire time he was out there. Now, it was finally time to go back home. Suddenly, the automatic guidance system malfunctioned, and the retro rockets that were supposed to fire and bring them home did not. Now, Belyayev would have to do it manually, by eye, at 17,000 miles per hour, with one shot, before they ran out of fuel. Then, Gagarin's voice came through on the radio, warm and relaxed as always, stating, quote, "How are you, Blondie? Where did you land?" As it turned out, Mission Control had heard nothing, and assumed they were already on the ground. Belyayev clicked on his microphone and explained, as steadily as he could, that the automatic system was inoperable, that they had fuel for one attempt, and that they were requesting emergency mode. The porthole Belyayev needed for visual alignment was positioned so awkwardly that he had to lie flat across both seats to see through it. Leonov held him in place while he worked, the two of them contorted, trying to manually thread a needle at orbital velocity. When Belyayev finally fired the retro rockets, he had to scramble back into his seat before the burn finished. It took him 46 seconds longer than planned. 46 seconds was enough to send them 1,250 miles off course. 10 seconds after the retro rockets fired, the descent capsule failed to break free from the rest of the spacecraft. The cable connecting the two modules had failed to release, and now they were hitting the upper atmosphere, joined together, spinning, whipping around each other as the air thickened around them. The instruments read 10G. Leonov could feel it in his eyes, something building and then bursting, small vessels going under the pressure. Outside the window, he could see exactly what was happening and understood with complete clarity that they might not survive it. Then, at around 60 miles up, the cable finally burned through, and at exactly 12:02 p.m., their parachute opened. Light died as they dropped through cloud cover. Just above the ground, the landing engine fired, and Voskhod 2 slumped into 6 feet of snow. Leonov looked out the window. Dense forest in every direction. No clearing, no signal flares, no way for a helicopter to see them, let alone land. They were 1,250 miles from where they were supposed to be, in the middle of the Siberian winter, and nobody was coming anytime soon. Shocked and still out of breath, Belyayev looked at Leonov and said, quote, "How soon do you think they'll pick us up?" Leonov thought about it and responded, quote, "In 3 months, maybe. They'll find us with dog sleighs." When they tried to open the exit hatch, it would not move, as it was jammed against a birch tree, the forest so dense around the capsule that the spacecraft had come to rest wedged between the trunks. Belyayev threw his shoulder into it, once, twice, until finally it gave and dropped into the snow below, disappearing entirely. At last, the men climbed out after it and sank into the snow up to their chins. Search aircraft found them within hours, circling overhead, unable to land in the trees. Supplies began raining down through the branches, including a bottle of cognac that hit the snow and shattered. Then a blunt axe, followed by 2 pairs of wolfskin boots, made it through intact. The light was already failing when they climbed out, and no helicopter was getting through that forest before morning. There was no choice. They were spending the night in the Siberian snow. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero. The capsule door was gone, just an open hatch where it had been, the Siberian wind coming straight in. And inside his suit, Leonov could feel it, the sweat from the airlock ordeal. 20 minutes of frantic maneuvering and a suit never designed for it. Both men stripped completely naked in the dark, wrung out their underclothes, poured the liquid out of their suits, and put everything back on wet. Outside, the trees were cracking in the cold. These were forests of bears and wolves. Mating season, or both are at their most aggressive, and they had only one pistol and limited ammunition to defend themselves. Thankfully, a rescue party arrived on skis the next morning, consisting of 2 doctors, a fellow cosmonaut, and a cameraman who started filming the moment he laid eyes on them. The group built a fire, flew in hot water from Perm, and laid out cheese, sausage, and bread. According to Leonov, after everything they'd just been through, it felt like a feast. On March 21st, they skied 9 miles through the forest to a clearing and were lifted out by helicopter. 2 days later, they landed back at Baikonur, while Korolev and Gagarin were waiting on the tarmac. Sirius faced it first, confused by the wolfskin boots and polar hats. Then Leonov and Belyayev got close, and both men broke into smiles and embraced. From that moment on, Alexei Leonov was a worldwide legend, though no one knew exactly just how close he and his partner had gotten to complete despair. 3 months later, on June 3, 1965, American astronaut Ed White stepped out of his Gemini 4 capsule and floated in space for 20 minutes. He had a handheld thruster to move around with, a larger hatch to climb back through, and his crewmate photographing him the whole time. It was clean, celebrated, and publicly heroic. What almost nobody knew at the time was that White's suit had stiffened too. The same physics, the same vacuum, the same overheating problem that had nearly stranded Leonov outside his spacecraft 3 months earlier. His hatch was simply wider, the path back inside easier. Nothing had been solved. White had just gotten lucky, just like Leonov. Within 5 years, both the Soviet and American space programs would quietly adopt a cooling system developed by British engineers. A piece of long underwear with water circulating through it that neither side had thought to use before 1965. A decade after nearly dying alone outside Voskhod 2, Alexei Leonov commanded the Soviet side of the Apollo-Soyuz mission, the first time American and Soviet spacecraft had ever docked in orbit. That July, he shook hands in space with the astronauts he'd spent a decade racing against. He would later describe them as dear and intelligent people who had decided to show the world that despite everything, the two sides could work together.